Micah. Nolan, you want to help? All right. They've got them all, so you grab some. We're bringing around an essay that we're going to read and discuss today. If you have been paying attention to the online resource folder, you'll notice that there are actually two essays in there. The reason for that is the first session that I prepped for this study is actually one of Chesterton's longer essays called on the drift from domesticity. And then I realized I was going to need to do enough introductory work that it was going to be difficult for us to go through that essay in its entirety. So instead I've given you a shorter essay to start with today. Literally, we just changed our minds Friday night as we were talking about it at youth group. Some of you have heard this essay before. Some of you have read this essay before. Some of you may remember that back during the COVID silliness, when I was doing a couple of weekly live streams, I did a video on this essay. So some of you may have seen that as well. We are going to be doing, for the latter part of this year, in this Sunday school class, kind of a guided reading and discussion of some of G.K. Chesterton's work. And this is part of something that the session has been letting me do. They've been very patient. I appreciate that. We did Pilgrim's Progress last year. Earlier this year, we did The Great Divorce, and those classes received a good bit of positive feedback. And so I asked the session if they wanted me to continue doing some things along this line, and if so, if they would let me do something from G.K. Chesterton. And they said, yeah, they thought that would be good. And I said, great, I want to do orthodoxy. And they said, yeah, don't do orthodoxy. But I'm a Presbyterian, so when my elders tell me not to do something, I'm not going to do it. So I'm going to give you some before we get to the essay, I'm going to give you some introductory material on Chesterton himself, because this is not typically the kind of Sunday school class you'd see in a Presbyterian church. I would love to see more classes like this in Presbyterian churches, and I'll tell you why here as we go. But anyway, so what we're going to be doing is some of his shorter work, some essays, probably some chapters from some of his books, and giving you a taste and a flavor of G.K. Chesterton, who is on an extremely short list of the authors that have been most influential in my life and my theological formation, my philosophical formation. I think the more you read Chesterton and Lewis, the better you will understand why I preach the way that I do, which is not the way that you're supposed to preach, but nonetheless, it's just the way it is. G.K. Chesterton was raised in the Church of England. I'm going to give you kind of a bio here in just a second. He later in life became Roman Catholic. And the reasons for that are numerous we could talk about. But I think that conversion to Rome is the reason that a lot of Reformed and Presbyterian Christians that I've talked to over the last 10 or 15 years are not fans of Chesterton, right? Now, if you follow Doug Wilson's ministry, you know Doug loves Chesterton, but he is an outlier in the Reformed community. Some of you have been to our house for lunch on Sundays, and for many years, when we would have a Sunday lunch crowd, I would pull out several books, and we would read selections from Lewis, from Chesterton, and from several other authors. And I've had so many Reformed Christians over the years tell me, why in the world would you read a Roman Catholic? I'm like, well, it's not that simple. Chesterton, a lot of his work was written before he actually entered the Roman Church. He continued to produce work after that, but a lot of his best work, I think, actually came before his entry into Rome. And even after his entry into Rome, his work exudes love for Christ, love for the truth, a commitment to the relentless power of the Christian faith. And that's very much because of his own experience in life, kind of leaving Christian faith and then coming back to it and really appreciating what he had earlier not appreciated and had abandoned, okay? So today I'm going to give you some introduction to G.K. Chesterton. Some of you already love him. Some of you may have kind of a hostile view of him. Some of you are just, you've never read anything by him. The reason we're not going to do orthodoxy, orthodoxy is outside of the scriptures, my favorite book. in the history of the world. I read it at least once every year, have for most of my adult life. And I've had many of you who have read Orthodoxy on my recommendation come back to me and say, I don't get it. Which is why the session didn't think we needed to start with Orthodoxy. But I hope that by the end of this little short series, you're going to be better prepared to read Orthodoxy and to enjoy it, and it rewards rereading, okay? Let's start with a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Gracious God and Father, we're thankful for the Lord's Day. We're thankful for the means of grace, for the hope of glory. We're thankful that you've met with us, that you've renewed covenant with us. We are comforted by your word and spirit. We rejoice in the salvation accomplished by your Son. We are eternally grateful for your love for us as a Father. Please bless all of the Sunday school classes, all of our children, our students, our teachers, and bless us in this class and in this room. Open our minds that we might see the wonders both of your word and of your work in creation and the world around us. Bless us, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. I've written up a little bit of an introduction to Chesterton. I've not given you a copy of this, but it will be posted later today, so you can have a copy of it if you want. I'm going to just kind of read through this, talk through this at the beginning to hit some of the key points if you're not familiar with who G.K. Chesterton is. Gilbert Keith Chesterton was born in London, England on May 29, 1874. He was a journalist, not in the modern sense of a news reporter, but in the earlier original sense of an essayist, public commentator, and cultural critic. Chesterton was educated at St. Paul's, but went to art school instead of college, as we think of it, though he did study literature for a while at University College in London. It's unclear if his brilliance is because he did not go to college. Correlation does not equal causation, but he clearly had an extraordinary mind shaped by literature, faith, and an uncanny ability to see magic in the midst of the modern world. Years ago, when I was in seminary, I suggested to one of my professors that someone should write a book about Chesterton, Lewis, and J. Gresham Machen walking into a bar together and having a conversation. Because all three of those men at the early period of the 20th century, obviously Chesterton a little bit before Machen, and Machen a little bit before Lewis, but all three of those men are dealing with the same issues in a lot of their work, and that is the rise of theological liberalism and the threats of modernism and a kind of scientific rationalism that is undermining the Christian faith and the foundations of Western civilization. And so if you read Machen's Christianity and Liberalism, if you read Lewis's Mere Christianity and the Abolition of Man, and if you read Chesterton's Orthodoxy and the Everlasting Man, you are going to be very well equipped to think about those issues that continue to shape our world to the present day. Chesterton was larger than life, both metaphorically and corporally, in both body and in conviction. He stood 6 foot 4 inches tall and weighed about 300 pounds. Chesterton's passion for truth, though, was even larger than he was. He was unafraid to state his opinions in strong, persuasive, and unapologetic terms. But he was always cheerful. He was not harsh or unfriendly. In many ways, he embodied and exemplified the stereotype of the jolly fat man. He maintained friendships even with some of the contemporary skeptics and interlocutors with whom he most strongly disagreed, men like George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells. Chesterton was unafraid to advocate for views that were controversial in his day. He was a loyal British subject, but he opposed the Boer War. And in 1922, think about the date, 1922, he wrote Eugenics and Other Evils, one of his shorter nonfiction works, a polemic against the idea of breeding a superior version of humanity that is in many ways a prescient critique in view of the rise of the Third Reich in the next decade. He anticipates that in many ways, and obviously he's interacting with philosophy that preceded the Third Reich, especially in the 19th century. An exact bibliography is difficult to collate. If you look up Chesterton's biography online, you're going to see a variety of estimates. As a general summary, he published 69 books before he died. At least 10 more books were published of his work after he died, he contributed to, he wrote about 100 books, and he contributed to 200 more, hundreds of poems, 5 plays, 5 novels, 200 short stories, and 4,000 newspaper essays. Ignatius Press published the complete works of G.K. Chesterton over a number of years. I think it's either 37 or 39 volumes. I've been in the process of collecting that for a number of years. Unfortunately, now some of the volumes are hard to find. So if you stumble upon a volume and you wonder, I wonder if Pastor Joel has this one, shoot me a text. Because if I don't, I want it. He wrote biographies, social commentary, literary criticism, fiction, theology, and philosophy with the ease of a man who retained what he read and understood it in a way that few scholars could. You'll see this especially in his biographies. Chesterton's approach to writing a biography, chaotic. It's like Spurgeon's advice on how he develops sermons. Don't ever take it. But it was absolutely anointed. I mean, like if you read Charles Spurgeon's sermons, you will be blessed by God, but no preacher should ever prepare a sermon the way that Spurgeon prepared his. And there's something similar with the way that Chesterton did a lot of his work. His biographies are not historically rigorous. They're not academic, and yet they are profoundly insightful. Profoundly, in ways that many academic biographies are not going to be. His work is still being collected and reprinted along with reflections upon an analysis of his work. Every year or every other year, new academic volumes are being published interacting with Chesterton because he left such a massive body of literature that people are still sorting through it and reflecting upon it. Few, if any, thinkers in any generation wrote with the breadth and insight that Chesterton did. I was thinking about how to write that particular sentence in this introduction. I was thinking, well, there are a handful of people in the history of the world who have written on many different subjects and yet have been able to penetrate deeply into each of those subjects. Very, very few. Most great authors, great thinkers, they have a very narrow range. Not Chesterton. He was a polymath in terms of his literary analysis. Others have penetrated more deeply into specific areas, but Chesterton was multi-talented. He was a Swiss Army knife among authors, and yet he did his work with the skill of a master craftsman. Now, Chesterton was somewhat absent-minded, kind of famously so. These are some hilarious anecdotes from his life about this. He would frequently be writing while he was traveling. So he would have a notebook and he would be writing in it while he was sitting in a train station and going from place to place, which meant that he was often late to wherever he was supposed to go, and he was also often lost. And he never seems to be bothered by it. In fact, one of his classic essays that we are going to read, Lord willing, this year, commends the adventure of it. He sees inconvenience in a different way. And I would commend it to you. In one telegram he sent to his wife Frances, Chesterton wrote, quote, "Am at Market Harborough. Where ought I to be?" He was jovial, satirical, witty, insightful, and unapologetically Christian. Unapologetically. The way that he interacts with his interlocutors, one of the things that makes his writings difficult, I'm going to talk about that in just a second, but the way that he interacts with them, even when he is writing to a harsh critic, he does it always with a smile on his face and the pen in his hand, right? I mean, he jokes in the opening of Orthodoxy about it's a very dangerous thing to challenge a man to write his views, right? So he's written heretics, he's written against all of these bad ideas in society, and they're like, well, Chesterton, what do you actually believe? He's like, funny that you ask. I'll write a book on that too. Chesterton was raised in the Church of England, but was troubled in his youth with despair and unbelief. He returned to the Christian faith as an adult, an experience he describes in the opening to Orthodoxy, in which he compares himself to a man who set out to discover a new land and inadvertently discovered England. His point is that when he sought reasonable answers for life's ultimate questions, what he found was not original in any way. It was the historic Christian faith in which he had been raised long before. God forbid that any of our covenant children have similar periods of doubt and despair and skepticism, but if they do, you want to have raised them on Chesterton. You want to have raised them on C.S. Lewis, both of whom depart and then return. They return. And when they come back, they are more powerful as apologists, as polemicists, as evangelists than they ever were before they left. Chesterton joined the Roman Catholic Church relatively late in life in 1922, a decision that has caused too many Presbyterians to overlook him and miss the tremendous value in his work. I'm going to tell you a story here. I'm going to be careful because I don't want you to ever identify who it involves. Nobody here knows him. But we had a ministerial student passing through Phoenix a number of years ago, and he was on his way to do an internship in another state within the OPC, and I quoted G.K. Chesterton in the sermon that morning, which is pretty common. And so after the service, he's talking to me, and he said, I noticed that you quoted G.K. Chesterton. I was like, that's right. He said, that's interesting. I've never read anything by him. Do you read him very often? I said, I'm actually constantly reading Chesterton. I'm reading something by Chesterton at any point throughout the year. Like, I'm just reading him all the time. He said, really? Wasn't he Roman Catholic? I said, well, yeah, he became a Roman Catholic later in his life. He said, oh, so you're reading him in order to kind of negatively critique and interact with him. And I said, no. I'm reading him because I'm blessed by him. And you could just see the puzzlement on this man's face. Like, he just did not know what to do with that. And I thought it was a shame that we are sending a ministerial student out to do an internship who has never read anything by G.K. Chesterton. How do you get through seminary without doing that? He was never assigned in any seminary I ever attended. Ever. But I want you to be reading Chesterton. My love for Chesterton is not to be taken as any commendation of Romanism at all. Stay tuned if you want to know what we think about Roman Catholicism. That's coming. C.S. Lewis gained much from the work of G.K. Chesterton. In fact, he credited his conversion in part to reading Chesterton's The Everlasting Man. The Everlasting Man is a larger tome. It's a heavier work. It's not at all hard to read, but if you can't handle orthodoxy, don't try to read Everlasting Man yet. That would be the sequence. Start with Chesterton's essays, start with his short stories, read some of his poems, then read orthodoxy, then read The Everlasting Man. But you'll be blessed by it. And Lewis came to faith partly through conversations with Tolkien and partly, he said, through reading The Everlasting Man. Lewis remained a Protestant to his death. And many Roman Catholics have said, well, Lewis, he was secretly Roman Catholic. And I'm thinking, have you read C.S. Lewis? Like, seriously? He's not secretly Roman Catholic. He's decidedly not Roman Catholic. And yet he could love and appreciate the Roman Catholics, including Chesterton, who had positively influenced his life. I believe we should be able to love the man and appreciate his work, even though we disagree with some of his conclusions and would strongly critique aspects of his theology. But while Chesterton was just as passionate in defending Roman Catholicism as anything else, his primary emphasis throughout his body of work is on simple, historic, Orthodox Christianity, and his work exudes a love for Christ. And I realize this triggers some Calvinists, but when people ask, well, do you actually think that Chesterton is saved? I cannot fathom Chesterton not being saved. In fact, I had an essay outlined about 5 years ago that I have not gotten around to finishing yet, arguing that if G.K. Chesterton is not saved, then you can't be. Because we're Calvinists. We believe that we're saved by the grace of God through faith in Jesus Christ, not by systematic theology. I think Roman Catholicism is Northern Israelite Christianity. It's wicked, it's idolatrous, and it's apostate. And I also happen to believe that many Roman Catholics are saved in spite of the idolatry that they're ensnared in. And if you can read G.K. Chesterton and come to any conclusion other than the fact that this man genuinely, sincerely, from the bottom of his heart, loves Jesus and is seeking to follow Him, I mean, if you have no hope of that person's salvation, I don't know why you would think you were saved. Is it because you have 5 points of Calvinism or because you attend a Presbyterian church. Chesterton frequently mocks Puritans and Calvinists in his writings. And this again, normally when people come here to RPC and they hear me talk about Chesterton, they start reading Chesterton, this is where they get bothered. And they say, wait a second, my pastor said I should read Chesterton and now he's poking fun at Puritans. Like, what gives with this? But those comments in Chesterton's corpus of work must be read in light of his historical context. The type of Puritanism and Calvinism that Chesterton saw in the UK in the late 19th century and early 20th century is a decomposed shell of its former biblical glory and joy. It is a shell. It is a rotting corpse. Regarding Chesterton's critique of the Puritans, it's helpful to remember what C.S. Lewis observed in one of his literary essays on John Donne. He said this, quote, "We have come to use the word Puritan to mean what should be called rather rigorist or ascetic. And we tend to assume the 16th century Puritans were puritanical in this sense. But there is no understanding of the period of the Reformation in England until we have grasped the fact that the quarrel between the Puritans and the Papists was not primarily a quarrel between rigorism and indulgence, and that insofar as it was, the rigorism was on the Roman side. On many questions, and especially in their view of the marriage bed, the Puritans were the more indulgent party. If we may, without disrespect, so use the name of a great Roman Catholic, a great writer, and a great man, they were much more Chestertonian than their adversaries. The idea that a Puritan was a repressed and repressive person would have astonished Sir Thomas More and Luther about equally," end quote. That's what you've got to understand. That when you hear Chesterton saying Puritans, like they're silly, they're bad, they don't even know the love of Jesus, he's not talking about the historic Puritans that you and I love. He's talking about the Puritan party as it existed at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s in the UK. And it's awful. And we should join with him in saying, that's silly, that's bad. That's not biblical Christianity. It's not the Puritan tradition at all. We should concur in his mockery of the kind of silly, stiff-collared, joyless Puritanism in his day, and we should aspire to be what Doug Wilson has called somewhat ironically, and the irony is on purpose here, Chestertonian Calvinists. We want to be Chestertonian Calvinists, right? Absolutely committed down to our bone marrow to the doctrines of grace, summarized in the points of Calvinism, but Chestertonian in our outlook and in our joy. Chesterton is more difficult to read in the 21st century than C.S. Lewis because of his historical situation. Most of Chesterton's work appeared prior to World War I. And even though that's not as far back as you might think, culturally, historically, it might as well be the Middle Ages. It might as well be the Middle Ages. When we think about the great wars of the past, in our recent past, most people think about World War II. You don't realize that World War I was the war to end all wars. They didn't call it World War I. They didn't think there would ever be a II. They hoped there wouldn't be. It was the Great War because it was a war unlike anything they'd ever seen. And that world is very unfamiliar to us. It's very unfamiliar to us. He died a little more than 3 years before Britain entered World War II. And remember, the Brits came into World War II years before we got involved. So the environment in which Chesterton is writing is more historically distant and less familiar to modern American readers. Lewis was profound, but he was not obscure. This is not true of all of Lewis's works, but it is definitely true of his popular works. So if you've read Mere Christianity, if you've read The Great Divorce, if you've read The Chronicles of Narnia, you think C.S. Lewis is so easy to read. If you read The Abolition of Man, you're reading references to a little green book, and you have no idea what he's talking about unless you understand the historical background. Well, that is more like all of Chesterton's work. He's constantly talking about people and events and places that are lost to an American audience at this point, that we're just not familiar with his world. He is just as profound and just as rewarding in rereading, but his meaning is not always easily grasped. And one of the things you have to remember is that so many of his essays, 4,000 essays, they were originally newspaper columns. They were originally published in newspapers. And it was like a weekly appearance. And so they are much more historically situated than a book that was written for a broader global audience would be. G.K. Chesterton died on June 14th, 1936. And in this class, I hope to give you a taste of his talents, to show you how he can help us learn to think Christianly and awaken a desire within you to read one of the authors who has had the greatest impact in my life and faith and view of the world. Okay? So, any questions about just that kind of preliminarily before we read on running after one's hat? All right. I'm going to read this essay to you. All right. Most of the essays I'm going to choose, most of the selection I'm going to choose are going to be short enough that we can read them in class so that you're not having to do homework, you're not having to pre-read. They will always be in the online folder before the class, so if you want to read them a couple of days ahead, that's great. We're going to do Drift from Domesticity next week. Chesterton wrote voluminously about the family. This is going to be the real challenge next week. I don't know how many weeks we're going to do family stuff from Chesterton, but it might be several. On Running After One's Hat. This was published in a collection of essays titled All Things Considered, 1908. I feel an almost savage envy on hearing that London has been flooded in my absence while I am in the mere country. My own Battersea, this is the part of London that he's from, has been, I understand, particularly favored as a meeting of the waters. Battersea was already, as I need hardly say, the most beautiful of human localities. Now that it has the additional splendor of great sheets of water, there must be something quite incomparable in the landscape, or waterscape, of my own romantic town. Battersea must be a vision of Venice. The boat that brought the meat from the butchers must have shot along those lanes of rippling silver with the strange smoothness of the gondola. The greengrocer who brought cabbages to the corner of the Latchmere Road must have leant upon the oar with the unearthly grace of the gondolier. There is nothing so perfectly poetical as an island, and when a district is flooded, it becomes an archipelago. Now, if you're not following, that is absolutely hilarious. Chesterton had gone away, he was out of town, and he hears reports that London has been flooded and that his own little community, Battersea, is underwater. Well, this is a disaster. The city's flooded. There's been flash floods everywhere. There's water in the streets. And he says, I cannot believe that I'm missing it. It must be amazing. As awesome as it was before, it's now like Venice. And he's imagining the milkman and the greengrocer like riding a boat through the street to deliver produce from the market. And he says, I have a savage envy that I have to be out of town right now. Now, how do you think everybody in London feels at this moment? Do you see immediately why I say this is a perspective on the world that Christians should have? This is a perspective on the world, I would argue, that only Christians can consistently have. And if you are the kind of Christian, or especially the kind of Reformed Christian, that walks around looking like you were weaned on a dill pickle, then when you start to read Chesterton, you're either going to not get it, or you're going to come under conviction, and you're going to quit reading Chesterton, or you're going to repent of your pagan pessimism. Because this is the way that a Christian should think about the world. And I don't say that because I do this well. I mean, this is one of the reasons I read Chesterton all the time, is because I want to be more Chestertonian than I am. I come from a long line of pessimists and grumblers, right? It's well embedded in my character. Chesterton inoculates us against it. We go on. Some consider such romantic views of flood or fire slightly lacking in reality. But really, this romantic view of such inconveniences is quite as practical as the other. The true optimist who sees in such things an opportunity for enjoyment is quite as logical and much more sensible than the ordinary indignant ratepayer who sees in them an opportunity for grumbling. Real pain, as in the case of being burnt at Smithfield or having a toothache, is a positive thing. It can be supported, but scarcely enjoyed. But after all, our toothaches are the exception. And as for being burnt at Smithfield, it only happens to us at the very longest intervals. In other words, we're not regularly burning people at Smithfield. It's happened. It doesn't happen every day. And most of the inconveniences that make men swear or women cry are really sentimental or imaginative inconveniences, things altogether of the mind. For instance, we often hear grown-up people complaining of having to hang about a railway station and wait for a train. Did you ever hear a small boy complain of having to hang about a railway station and wait for a train? No. For to him, to be inside a railway station is to be inside a cavern of wonder and a palace of poetical pleasures. Because to him, the red light and the green light on the signal are like a new sun and a new moon. Because to him, when the wooden arm of the signal falls down suddenly, it is as if a great king had thrown down his staff as a signal and started a shrieking tournament of trains. I myself am of little boys' habit in this matter. They also serve who only stand and wait for the 2:15. Their meditations may be full of rich and fruitful things. Many of the most purple hours of my life have been passed at Clapham Junction, which is now, I suppose, underwater. I have been there in many moods, so fixed and mystical that the water might well have come up to my waist before I noticed it particularly. But in the case of all such annoyances, as I have said, everything depends upon the emotional point of view. You can safely apply the test to almost every one of the things that are currently talked of as the typical nuisance of daily life. So Chesterton is very careful to say we're not talking about real pain. We're simply pointing out that most of the things that we gripe about every day is not real pain. You get to decide how much something bothers you.
Don't sweat the small stuff.
Yeah, exactly. You get to decide how much you are annoyed. Now, you tell this to your children all the time, maybe your grandchildren now, he's looking at me. So what? But then mom and dad essentially respond in the same way to all kinds of trivial, ridiculous things. And you say, I'm so bothered by this. I'm so inconvenienced by this. And Chesterton would say, it is in your mind. The problem is your mind. The problem is your attitude. It's not an objective problem. It's an inconvenience if your city floods. Granted, it's not the end of the world. And if we could recapture some of the wonder of a child, or if we could recapture a biblical, creational, covenantal, magical view of the world, we would find that we are not nearly as troubled as we often feel ourselves to be. I mean, Pastor Josh read as we were at the table this morning, you keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed upon you. Chesterton is constantly looking at the glories of Christ, and he's basically looking around at the world and saying, isn't this awesome? Isn't this great? We get to eat food. We get to smoke tobacco. We get to have friends. There are trains. For instance, paragraph 3. There is a current impression that it is unpleasant to have to run after one's hat. Now, again, historical context. This is when civilized men dressed like adults. If I have to run to the store and I'm not in uniform, I'm probably in cargo shorts and a jiu-jitsu t-shirt, right? I basically dress like this or like that all the time. You either see me in a collar or cargo shorts, right? Those are the only two options. That's all I own, right? Collar or cargo shorts. This is a world where civilized men dress like adults. Civilized women dress like beautiful ladies. And so a man always wears a hat. He always wears a hat. And he takes it off when he goes inside. The problem is that on a windy day, a hat is not like a baseball cap. Like, good luck blowing your baseball cap off your head with the wind. Now, if you ride your motorcycle, it'll come right off. But the wind's not going to take a baseball cap off your head. But it'll take a fedora or a top hat right off your head. And so Chesterton is saying there is a current impression that it is unpleasant to have to run after one's hat. Here's the dignified man in a top hat or a fedora. The wind knocks his hat off, carries it down the street, and now this dignified man, dressed like an adult, is having to run down the street trying to catch his hat. And it's just embarrassing. Why should it be unpleasant to the well-ordered and pious mind? Not merely because it is running, and running exhausts one. The same people run much faster in games and sports. The same people run much more eagerly after an uninteresting little leather ball than they will after a nice silk hat. There is an idea that it is humiliating to run after one's hat. And when people say it is humiliating, they mean that it is comic. It certainly is comic. He just means funny. But man is a very comic creature, and most of the things he does are comic. Eating, for instance. And the most comic things of all are exactly the things that are most worth doing, such as making love. A man running after a hat is not half so ridiculous as a man running after a wife. I mean, seriously, like, if you thought about it for half a second, most of the things we do every day are really kind of objectively silly. Like, they're funny if we would just take the time to notice it. And he says, well, it is funny to see a guy running after his hat, but we don't think it's funny when he's running after a ball on the ball field. And what's so interesting about a ball? That silk hat was expensive. Of course he's going to run and pick it up. Now, a man could, if he felt rightly in the matter, run after his hat with the most manliest ardor and the most sacred joy. He might regard himself as a jolly huntsman pursuing a wild animal, for certainly no animal could be wilder. In fact, I am inclined to believe that hat hunting on windy days will be the sport of the upper classes in the future. There will be a meet of ladies and gentlemen on some high ground on a gusty morning. They will be told that the professional attendants have started a hat in such and such a thicket, or whatever be the technical term. Notice that this employment will be, in the fullest degree, combined sport with humanitarianism. The hunters would feel that they were not inflicting pain. Nay, they would feel that they were inflicting pleasure, rich, almost riotous pleasure, upon the people who were looking on. When I last saw an old gentleman running after his hat in Hyde Park, I told him that a heart so benevolent as his ought to be filled with peace and thanks at the thought of how much unaffected pleasure his every gesture and bodily attitude were at that moment giving to the crowd. Now, if you didn't catch the reference, he's referring to the fact that the upper classes in Western Europe would for centuries have community hunts. Right? And the attendants would take a fox out, and you'd get the lords and ladies there, and the guys would jump on their horses, and they would have their hounds, and then the attendants would start the fox down the field in a thicket, and then they'd go chasing after him, right? And falconry and hunting stags, deer, like all kinds. That was just the sport of the upper classes. And Chesterton says, I really think that the future is hat hunting. It's hat hunting. And it's very humanitarian. And they are going to go about this in a manly way, with gusto, and give tremendous joy to all of the people who are looking on and laughing at how ridiculous they look. And then he describes this man in Hyde Park, this gentleman, this old gentleman running after a hat, and Chesterton wants to go up and thank him for the benevolence of his heart in giving so much pleasure to everyone who is trying not to laugh at this old man who can't catch his hat. The same principle can be applied to every other typical domestic worry. A gentleman trying to get a fly out of the milk, or a piece of cork out of his glass of wine, often imagines himself to be irritated. Let him think for a moment of the patience of anglers sitting by dark pools, and let his soul be immediately irradiated with gratification and repose. Again, I have known some people of very modern views, driven by their distress to the use of theological terms, which to which they have attached no doctrinal significance, merely because a drawer was jammed tight and they could not pull it out. You understand what he's saying there? They're using theological terms that they don't believe in. They're cursing because the drawer is stuck. A friend of mine was particularly afflicted in this way. Every day his drawer was jammed, and every day in consequence it was something else that rhymes to it. But I pointed out to him that this sense of wrong was really subjective and relative. It rested entirely upon the assumption that the drawer could, should, and would come out easily. But if, I said, you picture to yourself that you are pulling against some powerful and oppressive enemy, the struggle will become merely exciting and not exasperating. Imagine that you are tugging up a lifeboat out of the sea. Imagine that you are roping up a fellow creature out of an alpine crevasse. Imagine even that you were a boy again and engaged in a tug of war between French and English. Shortly after saying this, I left him. But I have no doubt at all that my words bore the best possible fruit. I have no doubt that every day of his life he hangs onto the handle of that drawer with a flushed face and eyes bright with battle, uttering encouraging shouts to himself and seeming to hear all round him the roar of an applauding ring. So I do not think that it is altogether fanciful or incredible to suppose that even the floods in London may be accepted and enjoyed poetically. Nothing beyond inconvenience seems really to have been caused by them. In other words, people haven't died. Homes haven't been destroyed. This wasn't Noah's flood. This was a flash flood that filled the streets up with water and got the carpets damp. And inconvenience, as I have said, is only one aspect, and that the most unimaginative and accidental aspect of a really romantic situation. An adventure is only an inconvenience rightly considered. An inconvenience is only an adventure wrongly considered. The water that girdled the houses and shops of London must, if anything, have only increased their previous witchery and wonder. For as the Roman Catholic priest in the story said, wine is good with everything except water. And on a similar principle, water is good with everything except wine. Now, the money quote is right there at the end. And it's a quote that I had my kids memorize many years ago. An adventure is only an inconvenience rightly considered. An inconvenience is only an adventure wrongly considered. Again, he's given you all the qualifications to interpret this properly. He's not talking about objective pain. He's not talking about actual disaster. He's talking about the ordinary experiences of frustration and exasperation by which we grumble and complain about things that we ought instead to simply enjoy. Drawers get stuck. Traffic snarls and runs us late. The wind blows our hat off our head. What's the big deal? Why are you so bothered by this? Now, let me tell you the difference between Chesterton and another, like most of my favorite authors are British, another great author, P.G. Wodehouse. Wodehouse wrote comedy. He wrote comedy. We'll never have a Sunday school class on Wodehouse. More's the pity, right? You can come to my house, and I will read you Wodehouse. And the first essay that I'll read you from Wodehouse, the first one I always read to someone who's not read Wodehouse, is My Battle with Drink. And it's hilarious. But Wodehouse is not writing theological comedy. He's just writing comedy. What Chesterton writes is thoroughly comedic, but it is substantively, structurally, and deliberately theological. That's the difference. So you can read, I nearly wrecked my car one time listening to a Wodehouse audiobook. I nearly ran off the 60 at 65 miles an hour because I was laughing so hard. But Chesterton, you're going to laugh if you're paying attention. If you're understanding what he's saying, you're going to laugh. But look at what he's saying. He's talking about a pious mind. He says it explicitly. He's talking about a Christian perspective. He's talking about a mind that has been awakened to the wonder of the world that God has made and said, isn't this amazing and isn't God good? And this agrees, I think, with so much in Scripture that does not set aside the reality of suffering, the reality of tragedy, the reality of pain. Christians weep with those who weep, and we rejoice with those who rejoice, but we're supposed to enjoy the life that God has given us. I mean, this is central to our Reformed tradition. Man's chief end is to glorify God and to be embittered and resentful forever. Well, that's not it. It's to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. And you say, by enjoyment, we do not mean take any pleasure in. No, we mean to take pleasure in God. And all of the good things that God is and that God does and that God has given to us, the Bible says, do all things without complaining and disputing. Do all things. Not do most things, not do something. Do everything without complaining and disputing. And that is a law of God. That is a command of God that I transgress every single day of my life. Every single day. I don't think there's been a day of my existence that I have not complained about something. And maybe that's not your experience. It's definitely mine. I get frustrated. I get exasperated. Even if I don't express it in an ungodly way, my heart is just knotted up inside over what? Almost always things that are far less significant than London being flooded. You get to decide how bothered you are by these things. Wherever we are, God has called us there. And He has called us there for His purpose and His glory. Let me leave you with two passages and we'll close. Lamentations 3, as Jeremiah weeps at the destruction of Jerusalem. He says, "Who is he who speaks and it comes to pass when the Lord has not commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that woe and well-being proceed? Why should a living man complain, a man for the punishment of his sins? Let us search out and examine our ways and turn back to the Lord. Let us lift our hearts and hands to God in heaven." And he's writing about real objective pain and tragedy. He's writing about real disaster. He is not writing about the air conditioning going out, which happened to us recently. And that was, not pleasant. And then you think about how many people live without air conditioning. And how many people have throughout the history of the world. Like, aren't you glad that you were born when you were? You have indoor plumbing. And yet we get so exercised about the most trivial things. And Jeremiah, watching his home burn and his brothers and sisters butchered in the streets, says we need to take our minds back to God. What do we have to complain about? He has not dealt with us according to our sins, nor punished us according to our iniquities. Romans 8:28, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to His purpose. What if the drawer is stuck because you need to be sanctified? I mean, obviously the drawer needs to be sanctified. But what if it's stuck because you need to be sanctified? Okay? So, that's a taste. That might be your first taste. You might already be very familiar with Chesterton. Next week, Lord willing, Drift from Domesticity. The text of that essay is already in the online resource folder. If you want to pre-read it, that's great. I'm also going to intersperse sections of that essay, time permitting, with some other quotes from other parts of Chesterton's work where he addresses similar themes. And Lord willing, we will be blessed by that. Okay?